All right, we are at the half hour, so we will get started. I will start off by sharing my screen. Okay, perfect. All right, so welcome everyone to our receiving feedback session today. I am Jace and I'm on the learning and development team here at GitLab. So I'll be taking us through the content today, and then we will have a people business partner on each call to assist with the Q&A portion. And on this call, we'll have Carolyn to assist with that. And with that, we'll go ahead and jump in. So for getting started, if everyone could open a browser and go to menti.com and enter the code 371304, we're going to have some interactive slides in this session. So if you could just pull that up, that would be great. We'll have reminders on those slides when we get to them. But if you have it ready to go, that will be perfect. So receiving feedback is an important skill to have, not just at work, but in life in general. And receiving constructive and even positive feedback can be a little difficult. So we're going to run through some items today to help with that. So first, we're going to talk about difficulties of receiving feedback. Then we'll jump into the importance of it. And then we'll run through some guidelines as well. So first, if everyone could go to Menti and answer the question, what makes receiving feedback difficult? And your answer doesn't have to be philosophical or research-based, just why is it difficult for you in particular? And your answers will all be anonymous, so no one will be able to see what you specifically have written. So if everyone could enter in some answers. Awesome. Definitely, these are all really good answers. So talking a little bit more about the difficulties of receiving feedback, here's a graphic to kind of demonstrate what it can sometimes feel like to receive feedback. And this is because our brains want to protect us, and receiving feedback is perceived by our brain the same way as a physical threat, like someone chasing you is, or like the shark. So because it's difficult to hear, it can feel like a threat to our survival and make it, so much harder for us to hear. And I hope your feedback giver does not look like this with the big teeth and the red eyes, but if that's the case, we will have a giving feedback session coming up in a few weeks. So hopefully we can help with that as well. And then feedback can be both positive and constructive. And here's a chart from some research on how much we want to give feedback and how much we want to receive it. So you can see we're like kind of comfortable with giving positive feedback. We really don't want to give constructive feedback. We do really want to hear the positive feedback, but even more than that, we want to hear the constructive feedback because we want to know how to improve, even though it can be painful to hear. And also, this chart doesn't mean that you should only give constructive feedback. Please still give positive feedback, but just so you can see what we're comfortable giving as far as feedback goes and what we're comfortable or what we want to receive. And then a few things to consider. First of all, feedback is really a gift. If someone's giving you feedback, take that as a compliment because they really feel you're worth their potential discomfort in giving the feedback and they want you to improve, and people should be giving feedback with positive intent. So keep that in mind. And then also giving feedback can be as difficult as receiving it. So, or even more difficult than receiving it because the giver of feedback doesn't want to hurt the receiver's feelings and things like that. So just a few things to keep in mind. And then the importance of feedback, here's kind of a list of different things, but feedback really is the most powerful yet most underused tool that we have. And it's powerful as it helps people get on track, and it serves as a guide to assist people in knowing how they and others perceive their performance. So just an example of what working without feedback is like. So it's like you're setting out on a road trip and you don't have a map, you don't have a compass, you don't get to use your phone, your map on your phone, your GPS in your car, and you get on the road and there are no road signs. So you have to figure out how to get to from point A to point B without any sort of guidance. And so that's what working without receiving any type of feedback is like. And people who don't get feedback tend to be either overly self-critical of themselves or overly self-congratulatory. So yeah, this is just because they're relying on just events that they personally see and not necessarily anyone telling them what went well or what didn't. So just something to keep in mind. And then we'll run through guidelines for receiving feedback that we have, and these are all laid out in the handbook as well, so you can go back and reference them. The first one is assume positive intent. So no matter what feedback you're receiving, just always assume that the giver of feedback is coming to you with a positive intent of, I want you to get better, I want you to know how you can improve. So always keep that in mind. And secondly, be an active listener. And this one is really hard because our brains really want us to run away. So just take the time to slow down, take in what they're saying, so that you can be reflecting, so you can reflect on it later. And then third, be respectful. So give them your full attention. When someone's giving you feedback, don't be, answering Slack messages or emails or things like that. Make sure you're focused in and listening to what they have to say. And fourth is ask questions. And I think a big piece of this, like for myself personally, I need time to process things. So I personally won't have questions right away. I'll need to think about it and then come back and ask questions. And that's totally fine. You don't have to have questions right away, but they can be really helpful to clarify, the feedback that you're receiving and how you can improve. So ask questions and then show appreciation. So say thank you and mean it. Like we've talked about, it's kind of uncomfortable for both parties. So thank the feedback giver for taking the time to give you feedback. And then 6 is reflect on the feedback. So take the time to reflect on what you've heard and then think about the action you want to take. There can be a pitfall of over engineering or overdoing your response. So it can also be helpful to maybe find a third party and get some feedback from them on if they've experienced this behavior from you as well, and if they have any tips for you from what they've experienced too. And then lastly is make a decision. So what are the most impactful actions that you can take and prioritize those? It's also important to note that when you receive feedback, you don't necessarily have to take action. That's your decision. It might be something where after you have reflected on it and you've maybe gotten a few other opinions, that it's not something that's a common theme for you. So you might decide not to take action. That's totally a decision that you can make. And then just know that after you make a decision, there will probably be some sort of follow-up. Either you should follow up with the feedback giver or they may follow up with you to see what your next steps are for taking some action. So just keep that in mind as well. And whether the feedback is positive or constructive, these can be helpful guidelines. And so now we're going to jump into just a few scenarios like we had before using Menti. So if you join the call after the first one we did, go to menti.com and enter this code to answer the following questions. So you are in a meeting. I haven't made the question live yet, so you can't answer it yet. But you're in a meeting and you accidentally say, hey guys. After the meeting, your colleague reaches out to you and tells you that you said guys during the meeting. So for all intents and purposes of this call, just assume that they gave you really great feedback. Like it was one-on-one, all of that. Like we don't have questions about how they gave the feedback. It was really great. So how do you respond to them giving feedback, or what is your next step as a feedback recipient? Awesome. I see a lot of thank yous. Perfect. Cool. Okay, so we'll go on to the next scenario. And this one is being a remote company. You all know we use text or written communication a lot, and your tone can sometimes be misinterpreted. So someone gives you the feedback that the tone they inferred from a written message you sent them seemed aggressive. What do you do next as the feedback recipient? Again, we're assuming that the feedback was given to us really well in a one-on-one situation and all of that. So awesome. Yeah, definitely acknowledge it, thank them, and yeah, these are all really good answers. So take some time to go through these when you have a chance. Awesome. So just a review of what we covered today. We went over difficulties of receiving feedback, the importance of it, and guidelines for receiving feedback. And with that, we'll leave the rest of the time for some Q&A. So I will hand it over to Carolyn to kind of facilitate that. But if you have questions, you can go ahead and put them in the agenda and we'll run through those. Or if you have any other tips that you want to share as well. You might not have a question, but if you have a tip that you want to share, that will be helpful too.
JC, I'd be happy to share some experience of mine.
Awesome, that'd be great.
So I've been in a leadership course in the past, and an acronym that the facilitator taught me was SBI, Situation, Behavior, Impact. So there's lots of ways to say it, but that was the kind of the terminology that resonated with me. So always being sure when you're providing feedback, whether it is constructive or positive, to be able to point to a specific time and place that you're referencing with that person. So being able to say, hey, when I saw you in the meeting, you said this, versus making a very broad statement such as like, well, when you are in meetings, I've seen you say, hey guys, versus saying, well, we were in this particular meeting. And then talking about the specific behavior that they're doing as well, whether it's something they're saying or a physical movement, or I mean, whatever the case, and then bringing it back to how that impacts maybe their perception, how others perceive them, or how I perceive them, or how that could impact their future growth at the company, or their ability to make a sale, or to perform better in their job, or whatever the case may be, but some sort of impact on them and how that behavior relates to that. So SBI, Situation, Behavior, Impact, was something that I've learned and used for years. You can even use it with your family and your children if you have them. So.
Thank you. And JC and I are smiling because we were just talking about the SBI model yesterday. And I think there's going to be a session on delivering feedback to come. And so that was the model we were looking at, kind of framing the training around. So thank you for sharing that. Sean, do you want to verbalize your question?
Yeah, sure. So mine was, how do you explain your intent, but also acknowledge the other person's feelings? So for me, like, I have ADHD, and it isn't as easy for me to get my thought across since I think in pictures. So to me, it's like a flip book, right? Like when you have that little cartoon flip book and it changes, that's how my thoughts are. So it's difficult for me to, when I say something, sometimes it comes across as too direct, and people think that my intent is not as good as it should be, but it's just very difficult for me to think about it because it takes me about 5 or 6 minutes to get there. So within that first minute and a half, it's just difficult for me to, I guess, acknowledge someone's feelings and say like, I'm listening to you, I hear you, but I'm trying to explain this. So a lot of people have told me, stop trying to explain your intent, but it's important to me. Sorry.
Yeah. Is that when you're receiving feedback or delivering feedback or both?
It's usually receiving. So a lot of times people say that I act like I'm being attacked when I'm getting feedback, but for me, I'm trying to explain my thought process.
Right.
As to why I gave you that response. And they're like, well, you're arguing with me. So I just sit there and don't say anything. And then I think that might be worse.
Yeah, well, I think verbalizing what your internal dialogue is, I think is always a good tactic. And you don't have to respond to feedback in the moment. I think that's something that's a little bit of a misperception. I think you can say, hey, I'm just going to try to process this and I'll follow back up with you at a later time. Because there is, I think, naturally an emotional response. And sometimes you do need time to think about, hey, what was my intention when I, was behaving in a certain way, if they were, delivering feedback in an SBI model, or how do I want to change my behavior in the future? You might not know right on the spot. So I think it's okay to say, hey, thank you for the feedback. I'm going to think about this and I'll get back to you. So that way you're not just leaving it completely unanswered, but it's giving you time to go through your own process without, responding right away, and for that to feel like a defensive type of tone. I don't know if that's helpful, but that's what I'd recommend.
Okay, it is. I've been doing that lately because usually when I respond, it's emotional right away. So I try not to do that because, I don't want to snap at someone. Like they'll say like, oh, we work really hard on this team. And I'm like, what do you mean I don't work hard? And then I'm like, wait. Like, let me take a step back, like give it an hour or two and then come back and talk to them. But a lot of people, I think, want you to respond right away and engage with them. And like you said, for me, it's just, I need an hour or two to digest that feedback and then give a good response without sounding rude.
Yeah. And I think as long as you're saying to them, hey, I'm going to thank you for the feedback, I'm going to digest this and get back to you, I think that's totally fine. And actually, I recommend that, especially if the feedback's complex and you do feel, getting emotional. I think you have to really think about the feedback and digest it before you can respond accordingly. So thank you for your question.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Nicholas, do you want to verbalize your question?
Yes. So I've tried to find something about this in the handbook because I thought there is something about difference in culture and language, but I wasn't able to do that. So there is sometimes like a cultural difference in language where like some cultures are very direct with phrasing something versus others are not. And it's fine both ways. It's just like sometimes, for example, for me as an European cultured person, I'm very direct and I sometimes feel bad when I phrase feedback, and I would like to ask if someone else has the same experience and how do you deal with that?
So JC, I'm going to throw this back to you since I'm fairly new. Do you know if anything exists in the handbook? Oh, I see you're added a link.
Yeah, I just added a link, and I know we've talked about probably a while ago about the culture map. It's a book, and it can be helpful in just understanding different cultures and how they're different and like respond to things differently. So I'm just trying, I thought there was a link to the culture map in the handbook, but I'm not finding it. Oh, right here. I'll add this to the agenda and you can take a look at it as well.
And it looks like Rose is adding a link to a helpful book, which is great. Rose, do you know anything about the book that is it the Culture Map book?
Yeah, it's a Culture Map book, and actually there's a new book come out. I think what she collaborated with, it's Erin Meyer, and it collaborated with Netflix to write on their culture, but side notes. So I know about the book. It's 7 scales, and it's explaining how different countries have, for example, need high context versus low context. So I think, for example, in Asian cultures like China, for example, you need a very high context from your cultural perspective to understand things. So for example, that you greet people differently. And in the Netherlands, for example, it's very low context. So we give a lot of context while we're speaking. So you don't have to know about a lot of context to understand. In terms of feedback, there's also an interesting part in it on receiving a lot of like how used employees are or peers are in receiving feedback. So some cultures are used to giving a lot of negative feedback, while some cultures are less used to receiving a lot of negative feedback or giving more positive feedback, for example. So it's, yeah, that's, I think it's very, I cannot explain it like very well in like 5 minutes, but I would just recommend to read the book or that part of the book.
Thank you. Another thing that I've found helpful, because while there are cultural differences for sure, I think each individual person is a different human being. And some people are okay with direct feedback and appreciate it and want that. And then some people may, want more time to digest, may want feedback in a certain format. So I've found asking, after I've delivered feedback, asking for feedback on my feedback delivery. I know that that's like kind of complex, but it seems to work. I think when you say how, like, I wanted to provide you this feedback. Is the way I delivered it a way that works for you? Or would you prefer a different way for me to communicate that? Whether it be, did you want me to deliver feedback in writing first so you can digest and we can discuss after, or how did you perceive the feedback that I gave you? I think that can help too, because I think each individual has their own preferences and their own style. So that's just another tip. Does anyone else have any experience with this or any feedback on the cultural piece?
Mike, did you raise your hand?
I did. Sorry, took me a minute to get off mute there. And I wasn't sure if you were using the hands, but I was just thinking that what I do as a manager is hopefully before I get into a situation where I need to deliver or receive feedback, I meet with the people on my team. I just talk about kind of how they like to work and how they'd like to work with me, so that maybe I have a chance to adjust my style when the time comes. And you can't do that with everybody, obviously, in the whole company. But I think that there's a pretty good chance that if we're giving or receiving feedback, most of the time it's going to be within that smaller group of our teams. So learning in advance how people communicate, how they like to work, learning more about them and their style allows you to adapt your style some. And then you can hope that they are doing the same thing. And to me, that's always been the best chance, because you don't have a lot of real good success probability of knowing 1,000 different ways to communicate with 1,000 different people. But if everybody has the mindset that we understand that these things can be different, if we do assume positive intent, then I think that gives you a better chance to succeed in the feedback setting.
Thank you. Frederick, do you want to verbalize your question?
Yes, thank you. Well, actually, for me, it's when you're receiving feedback on a long period of time. So let's say, at least I can talk in my experience in programming, where no matter kind of what you do, you will constantly receive ongoing feedback from other developers. And on a long period of time, even if you're improving all the time and everyone acknowledge your progress or that everything's going well, at some point it can feel like you're always receiving feedback, and that there's never a moment where you can be, here you go. Now I feel great. I feel like I'm in a kind of more comfortable position. And so in the past, I experienced this in my previous employment, where I had to kind of figure out a way for myself to accept that it's just a way that the way that things go. But I was wondering if there are like tools or more like different ways of seeing that problem.
Is the feedback that you're receiving on like a similar type of behavior or skill, or is it different?
I would say it's different, as in like it can be like a technical like you're always working on different aspects. So the feedback is always different. It's not like the same behavior, and every time like you're doing something, you're getting the same feedback on the same thing. That's a different issue. That would be on my part.
Yeah. So you're saying like, just so I'm understanding the question, that, when you're in a learning culture, you're getting feedback all the time. How do you kind of distill what you need to work on, or it feels overwhelming, basically, to have all of, feedback coming at you all of the time? And so, yeah, I think that it's a really good question, and it's a skill in itself, right? To really kind of take feedback, listen to it, and really glean the themes and the skills that you want to focus on to really make those strides and improvements. And I find that your manager can often be a really good sounding board. Sometimes it takes a third party for you to share the feedback you've been receiving, share things like your career goals with that person, and have them help you distill where you want to focus. If you're, a manager or a mentor can typically be a good person to help you think through it, because I understand that it can seem like there's, a lot of different things to work on, and it's hard to really kind of focus on the few that will make the most impact for you personally. And I think that relying on someone else to help you verbalize your own thoughts and distill the themes that are important to you is important. So that would be my recommendation. And we probably, JC, I'm thinking we should maybe do some more manager training on how to help folks through those kind of career conversations. So thank you for raising it. It's a really good point. Does anyone else have any tips on that question that they want to share?
Frederick, are you talking also about like reviews that you get on your code all the time? Yeah, I suffered from that a lot. So basically, as a developer, you get daily reviews, and it can be hard on yourself because nothing that you do is always perfect. So you get always a review, and separating that your work, your code from your personal well-being is hard. It takes time. Yeah, just we're in the same boat. That's all what I want to say.
Yeah, I think it's a shared problem amongst developer. So but thank you. I think it's good to know that other people are also suffering. It makes me feel better.
There's one thing that I've told people, if they ever want to give feedback and they feel like that they're going to get negative feedback, you can always like message me or Zoom me, and then just like let me see, like just tell me what you think you're going to say. Usually I'm pretty good with that, just because at my previous jobs, I've had people tell me that I'm a technical translator, and I was like, what do you mean? And they're like, well, sometimes I don't know how to talk to people in sales or like an AM. So you're very good at like bridging that gap between like tech, because you're like technically sound, but you're also like really good at talking to like account people or sales. So I feel like that might have helped some people. So if anybody ever wants to, like, I'm here.
That's a great suggestion. I think if you feel, and again, this is going more into the delivering feedback, but if you even receiving feedback, if you're paused and want to digest and pair with someone on how do I think about this? Can I talk it through with you? That's always okay. And I would say recommended, especially if it's something you need to think through. And oftentimes that mirror, that sounding board is really helpful.
Yeah.
And we are over time. Thank you so much for the reminder.
There is a feedback form in the agenda, so please fill that out so we know how to improve for next time. And yeah, we have 2 more calls today, so encourage your teams to attend, and we'll see you all later. Thanks.
Bye, y'all.
Bye.